The moment she screamed for me to keep driving, I knew whatever was chasing us didn't care about roads, laws, or mercy, only about catching up before dawn and finishing what it had started. Her nails were digging into my arm. Her breath smelled like smoke and rain, and her eyes, God, her eyes, were black all the way through, like the night had hollowed them out and moved in. If stories like this pull you in, if you believe some roads are cursed and some strangers are sent for a reason, tap like and subscribe now. You'll know by the end whether you agree with me or not, because this isn't the kind of tale you forget once it starts breathing on you. I should back up, though, because it didn't begin with the chase or the screaming or the fire in my rearview mirror. It began hours earlier, when I decided to take the county road instead of the highway, telling myself I'd save 10 minutes and a little gas, telling myself I wasn't the kind of man bad things followed, even though my life up to that point was basically a scrapbook of wrong turns and near misses. The county road cut through miles of nothing, fields stitched together by old fences, trees bent like arthritic fingers, and a sky so low and heavy it felt personal, like it had a grievance with me. And the radio faded in and out until it finally gave up, leaving me alone with the hum of tires and my own thoughts, which were already circling the familiar drain of regret. That's when I saw her, standing dead center in my headlights, barefoot on the asphalt as if the cold didn't exist, wearing a pale dress torn at the hem and darkened with mud, and something else I didn't want to identify, her hair plastered to her face like she'd been dragged backward through the night. I hit the brakes hard enough to smell rubber, my heart slamming so violently I thought it might break ribs, and for a split second I considered the sane option, locking the doors and reversing, but then she lifted her head and looked at me, and whatever sanity I had lined up and quietly resigned. There were no whites in her eyes, no reflection of my headlights, no depth, just endless black. And when she spoke, it wasn't loud or hysterical, but calm in the way people get right before something terrible happens. "Please," she said, palm flattening against my hood as if she needed the warmth. "Drive me away, he's hunting." I didn't ask who he was, didn't ask why her voice carried the weight of a warning instead of a plea. I just reached across and unlocked the door, because some instincts feel older than choice. The second she slid into the passenger seat, the air in the car changed, thickened, like a storm rolling in through closed windows, and my dashboard lights flickered as if they were reconsidering their commitment to reality. I pulled back onto the road, tires whining, and that's when the first set of headlights appeared behind us, too bright, too close, riding my bumper like they'd been there the whole time, just waiting for her to stop running. She twisted in her seat to look back, her expression almost relieved, and said, "He doesn't like it when I get help." The road ahead began to feel wrong, stretching and narrowing in subtle ways that made my stomach lurch, and every instinct I had told me this wasn't just a car following us, but the beginning of something with rules I didn't understand and penalties I couldn't afford. More headlights flared in the mirrors. 1, then 3, then too many to count. Emerging from side roads I knew didn't exist, engines growling in different pitches like a pack learning each other's voices, and somewhere behind them all was a presence I couldn't see but could feel, a pressure in my chest that synchronized with my pulse. I asked her what he wanted, and she laughed softly, the sound brittle and exhausted, and said, "He wants what he always wants, what he thinks he owns." And when I told her we'd lose them, that I knew these roads, she shook her head and opened my glove compartment without asking. Inside, where there should have been insurance papers and old napkins, were 40 matches laid neatly side by side, their heads glowing faintly white, like teeth in moonlight. "They don't work like normal fire," she said, already striking one, and when she tossed it out the window it didn't fall. It flew backward, cutting through the dark like it had purpose, exploding into heat and light that swallowed the nearest set of headlights in a scream of metal and smoke. I didn't slow down, couldn't, as another match lit and another vehicle vanished in flame, the night behind us unraveling into chaos. And in the midst of it all I caught a glimpse of him at last. Not a face, not a body, but a shape where the darkness bent inward, where the road itself seemed to bow, and I understood with a sick clarity that this chase had been happening long before I ever turned onto that road. Her voice steadied as the matches burned, as if every flame took a little weight off her shoulders, and she told me she'd been running for years, that some bargains rot instead of breaking, that not every angel comes from heaven and not every monster needs claws to tear you apart. By the time the last match flared and the engines behind us went silent, dawn was bleeding into the sky, and the road straightened as if nothing had happened. But my hands were still shaking, and my life was no longer the simple thing it had been an hour before. We slowed on a bridge I didn't remember approaching, the river below steaming like it knew what we'd just done, and as she opened the door to leave, whole and unmarked now, she looked back at me with eyes finally showing white at the edges and said, "You didn't ask what I am." And when I told her it didn't matter, she smiled like someone who hadn't heard that in a very long time. Because sometimes the story chooses you, and once it does, there's no pretending you didn't see how the night really works. I thought it was over once she stepped out onto that bridge and disappeared into the mist. Thought the smoke rising behind us was just the last echo of a nightmare burning itself out. But the quiet that followed was too deliberate, too clean, like the pause someone takes before knocking again harder. I sat there with the engine idling, hands locked around the wheel, watching the river churn beneath the guardrails. When the pressure returned to my chest, and I realized the hunter hadn't lost the trail, he had simply changed tactics. The sky brightened in thin, bruised streaks of dawn, yet the road refused to look ordinary again. Shadows clinging to the edges of my vision like they were waiting for instructions. And when I finally drove off the bridge, my headlights caught something carved into the asphalt ahead of me. A symbol burned so deeply it looked older than the road itself. Lines curling inward like they were trying to remember how to be whole. I told myself it was stress, adrenaline, my brain scrambling for patterns. But the farther I went, the more signs appeared. Dead animals laid carefully along fence posts, trees scarred with deep gouges, the air thick with that same iron and smoke smell she'd carried. And with each mile, I felt less like a man heading home and more like a message being delivered. I stopped at a gas station just outside town, hands still trembling as I filled the tank, and the clerk inside watched me with narrowed eyes, the kind reserved for people who look like they've seen something they shouldn't have survived. When I asked if anyone else had passed her recently, anyone matching her description, his face drained of color, and he told me no one walked those roads at night unless they were running or chasing. And either way, they didn't usually make it back. The moment I pulled away, my phone buzzed. No service, yet a notification anyway. Just a single photo attached to no sender, showing my car from behind. Taillights glowing red in the dark, smoke curling where the road should have been empty. The hunter was close again, not in a line of headlights this time, but in the way the world leaned subtly out of alignment. Radios whispering half-words, streetlights flickering as I passed, dogs howling from houses I couldn't see. I tried to remind myself that whatever she'd done with those matches had hurt him, slowed him, but predators adapt, and this one had patience measured in lifetimes. Memories that weren't mine began to bleed into my thoughts, fields burning under moonlight, women running until their feet split open, deals made in desperation and sealed in blood. And I understood with growing horror that helping her hadn't just put me in his path. It had marked me as someone who interfered. The symbol from the road appeared again on a billboard, then scratched into the hood of my car when I stopped at a light, as if the metal itself wanted to confess. And that's when I heard her voice, not from the passenger seat, but from somewhere deeper, steadier. "Don't stop." I drove past my own street, past the turnoff to safety, following a pole I couldn't explain toward the old industrial edge of town, where warehouses sat empty and the river widened, steam rolling off it like breath. The pressure in my chest sharpened until I thought my heart might simply give up, and when the hunter finally showed himself, it wasn't with noise or violence, but with certainty, a tall silhouette forming at the far end of the road, the darkness around him folding inward like it recognized its master. He spoke without moving his mouth, words settling directly behind my eyes, telling me I'd made a mistake, that what I'd protected was property, that debts like hers didn't disappear just because 40 angels had burned their wings on his behalf. I answered without thinking, telling him she was gone, that he'd lost, and for the first time the shape hesitated, the night rippling like disturbed water. The river surged behind me, wind whipping hard enough to rock the car, and I felt the echo of those matches in my bones, a heat that wasn't fire but resolve. And I realized part one of this story hadn't been about saving her at all. It had been about choosing a side. When the hunter reached for me, the symbol on my hood flared white hot, and somewhere in the distance, unseen but unmistakable, something answered, reminding him that even hunters have rules they pretend not to believe in. And as the darkness recoiled just enough for me to breathe again, I understood the truth settling heavy and unavoidable. The chase wasn't over. It had just widened, and now I was fully, irrevocably inside it. The darkness didn't vanish when the hunter withdrew. It loosened, like a clenched fist deciding not to strike. Yet, and that restraint felt more unsettling than any outright attack, because it meant he was thinking, recalculating, filing my name somewhere old and permanent. I stayed in the car long after the wind died down, watching the river settle back into its slow, indifferent rhythm, until the symbol on my hood cooled and faded into nothing more than a scar in the paint, proof that some things burn themselves into you and then pretend they were never there. When I finally drove home, the streets looked ordinary again, porch lights glowing, trash cans tipped over by raccoons, the soft illusion of safety everyone agrees not to question. And yet I moved through it all like a ghost, aware of layers beneath the surface that I could no longer unsee. Days passed without incident, then weeks, and I almost convinced myself the hunter had retreated for good, that whatever rules had checked him that night were stronger than his patience. But the quiet never felt empty. It felt observant. I began noticing people on the edges, women with too tired eyes at bus stops, men pacing gas stations like they were waiting for permission to run. And sometimes, just for a second, I'd catch a reflection that didn't match the face it belonged to, a flicker of black where white should be, and I'd know the chase was still happening, just not always for me. I never saw her again, not in person, but sometimes I find a match on my windshield or tucked into my jacket pocket, its head pale and cool, a reminder rather than a weapon, and I understood that survival had made us part of the same quiet network of interference. The hunter kept his distance, honoring whatever boundary had been drawn that night, yet I could feel his attention like weather pressure before a storm, and I knew if I ever turned away from someone who asked for help the way she had, that boundary would collapse. So I didn't. I stopped when people waved me down. I listened when stories sounded impossible, and every time I chose to drive instead of locking the door, the night seemed to retreat just a little, as if reminded that even in a world built for predators, there are still roads they don't fully control, and sometimes that's enough.